this week's Grimm Fairy Tales, The Little Folks' Presents. A tailor and a goldsmith were traveling together, and one evening when the sun had sunk behind the mountains, they heard the sound of distant music, which became more and more distinct. It sounded strange, but so pleasant that they forgot all their weariness and stepped quickly onwards. The moon had already arisen when they reached a hill on which they saw a crowd of little men and women who had taken each other's hands and were whirling round in the distance with the greatest pleasure and delight. They sang to it most charmingly, and that was the music which the travelers had heard. In the midst of them sat an old man who was rather taller than the rest. He wore a party-colored hat, and his iron-gray beard hung down over his breast. The two remained standing full of astonishment and watched the dance. The old man made a sign that they should enter, and the little folks willingly opened their circle. The goldsmith, who had a hump, and like all hunchbacks was brave enough, stepped in. The tailor felt a little afraid at first and held back, but when he saw how merrily all was going, he plucked up his courage and followed. The circle closed again directly, and the little folks went on singing and dancing with the wildest leaps. The old man, however, took a large knife which hung to his girdle, whetted it, and when it was sufficiently sharpened, he looked round at the strangers. They were terrified, but they had not much time for reflection, for the old man seized the goldsmith and with the greatest speed shaved the hair of his head clean off. And then the same thing happened to the tailor, but their fear left them when after he had finished his work, the old man clapped them both on the shoulder in a friendly manner, as much as to say they had behaved well to let all that be done to them willingly and without any struggle. He pointed with his fingers to a heap of coals which lay at one side, and signified to the travelers by his gestures that they were to fill their pockets with them. Both of them obeyed, although they did not know of what use the coals would be to them, and then they went on their way to seek a shelter for the night. When they had got into the valley, the clock of the neighboring monastery struck 12, and the song ceased. In a moment all had vanished, and the hill lay in solitude in the moonlight. The two travelers found an inn, and covered themselves up on their straw beds with their coats, but in their weariness forgot to take the coal out of them before doing so. A heavy weight on their limbs awakened them earlier than usual. They felt in the pockets and could not believe their eyes when they saw that they were not filled with coals, but with pure gold, happily too. The hair of their heads and beards was there again, and thick as ever. They had now become rich folks, but the goldsmith, who in accordance with his greedy disposition had filled his pockets better, was as rich again as the tailor. A greedy man, even if he has much, still wishes to have more. So the goldsmith proposed to the tailor that they should wait another day and go out again in the evening in order to bring back still greater treasures from the old man on the hill. The tailor refused and said, "I have enough and am content. Now I shall be a master and marry my dear object," for so he called his sweetheart, "and I am a happy man." But he stayed another day to please him. In the evening the goldsmith hung a couple of bags over his shoulders, that he might be able to stow away a great deal, and took the road to the hill. He found, as on the night before, the little folks at their singing and dancing, and the old man again shaved him clean, and signed to him to take some coal away with him. He was not slow about sticking as much into his bags as would go, went back quite delighted and covered himself over with his coat. "Even if the gold does weigh heavily," he said, "I will gladly bear that." And at last he fell asleep with the sweet anticipation of waking in the morning an enormously rich man. When he opened his eyes, he got up in haste to examine his pockets, but how amazed he was when he drew nothing out of them but black coals. And that howsoever often he put his hands in them. "The gold I got the night before is still there for me," thought he. Went and brought it out, but how shocked he was when he saw that it likewise had again turned into coal. He smote his forehead with his dusty black hand, and then he felt that his whole head was bald and smooth, as was also the place where his beard should have been. But his misfortunes were not yet over. He now remarked for the first time that in addition to the hump on his back, a second just as large had grown in front on his breast. Then he recognized the punishment of his greediness and began to weep aloud. The good tailor, who was wakened by this, comforted the unhappy fellow as well as he could, and said, "Thou hast been my comrade in my traveling time. Thou shalt stay with me and share in my wealth." He kept his word, but the poor goldsmith was obliged to carry the 2 humps as long as he lived, and to cover his bald head with a cap. The Gnome. There was once upon a time a rich king who had 3 daughters who daily went to walk in the palace garden. And the king was a great lover of all kinds of fine trees, but there was one for which he had such an affection that if anyone gathered an apple from it, he wished him 100 fathoms underground. And when harvest time came, the apples on this tree were all as red as blood. The 3 daughters went every day beneath the tree and looked to see if the wind had not blown down an apple. But they never by any chance found one, and the tree was so loaded with them that it was almost breaking, and the branches hung down to the ground. Then the king's youngest child had a great desire for an apple, and said to her sisters, "Our father loves us far too much to wish us underground. It is my belief that he would only do that to people who were strangers." And while she was speaking, the child plucked off quite a large apple and ran to her sisters, saying, "Just taste, my dear little sisters, for never in my life have I tasted anything so delightful." Then the 2 other sisters also ate some of the apple, whereupon all 3 sank deep down into the earth, where they could hear no cock crow. When midday came, the king wished to call them to come to dinner, but they were nowhere to be found. He sought them everywhere in the palace and garden, but could not find them. Then he was much troubled and made known to the whole land that whosoever brought his daughters back again should have one of them to wife. Hereupon so many young men went about the country in search, that there was no counting them, for everyone loved the 3 children because they were so kind to all, and so fair of face. 3 young huntsmen also went out, and when they had traveled about for 8 days, they arrived at a great castle, in which were beautiful apartments, and in one room a table was laid, on which were delicate dishes, which were still so warm that they were smoking. But in the whole of the castle no human being was either to be seen or heard. They waited there for half a day, and the food still remained warm and smoking, and at length they were so hungry that they sat down and ate, and agreed with each other that they would stay and live in that castle, and that one of them, who should be chosen by casting lots, should remain in the house, and the 2 others seek the king's daughters. They cast lots, and the lot fell on the eldest. So next day the 2 younger went out to seek, and the eldest had to stay home. At midday came a small mannikin, and begged for a piece of bread. Then the huntsman took the bread for which he had found there, and cut a round off the loaf, and was about to give it to him. But whilst he was giving it to the mannikin, the latter let it fall, and asked the huntsman to be so good as to give him that piece again. The huntsman was about to do so and stooped, on which the mannikin took a stick, seized him by the hair, and gave him a good beating. Next day, The second stayed at home, and he fared no better. When the two others returned in the evening, the eldest said, "Well, how have you gotten on?" "Oh, very badly," said he. And then they lamented their misfortune together, but they said nothing about it to the youngest, for they did not like him at all, and always called him Stupid Hans, because he did not exactly belong to the forest. On the third day, the youngest stayed at home, and again the little mannequin came and begged for a piece of bread. When the youth gave it to him, the elf let it fall as before, and asked him to be so good as to give him that piece again. Then said Hans to the little mannequin, "What? Canst thou not pick up that piece thyself? If thou wilt not take as much trouble as that for thy daily bread, thou dost not deserve to have it." Then the mannequin grew very angry, and said he was to do it, but the huntsman would not, and took my dear mannequin and gave him a thorough beating. Then the mannequin screamed terribly and cried, "Stop! Stop and let me go, and I will tell thee where the king's daughters are." When Hans heard that, he left off beating him, and the mannequin told him that he was an earth mannequin, and that there were more than 1,000 like him, and that if he would go with him, he would show him where the king's daughters were. Then he showed him a deep well, but there was no water in it, and the elf said that he knew well that the companions Hans had with him did not intend to deal honorably with him. Therefore, if he wished to deliver the king's children, he must do it alone. The two other brothers would also be very glad to recover the king's daughters, but they did not want to have any trouble or danger. Hans was therefore to take a large basket, and he must seat himself in it with his hanger and bell and be let down. Below were 3 rooms, and in each of them was a princess with a many-headed dragon, whose head she was to comb and trim, but he must cut them off. And having said all this, the elf vanished. When it was evening, the two brothers came and asked how he had got on, and he said, "Pretty well so far," and that he had seen no one except at midday when a little mannequin had come and begged for a piece of bread, that he had given some to him, but that the mannequin had let it fall and had asked him to pick it up again. But as he did not choose to do that, the elf had begun to lose his temper, and that he had done what he ought not, and had given the elf a beating, on which he had told him where the king's daughters were. Then the two were so angry at this that they grew green and yellow. Next morning they went to the well together and drew lots who should first seat himself in the basket, and again the lot fell on the eldest, and he was to seat himself in it and take the bell with him. Then he said, "If I ring, you must draw me up again immediately." When he had gone down for a short distance, he rang, and they at once drew him up again. The second seated himself in the basket, but he did just the same as the first, and then it was the turn of the youngest, but he let himself be lowered quite to the bottom. When he had got out of the basket, he took his hanger and went and stood outside the first door and listened, and heard the dragon snoring quite loudly. He opened the door slowly, and one of the princesses was sitting there, and had 9 dragon heads lying upon her lap, and was combing them. Then he took his hanger and hewed at them, and the 9 fell off. The princess sprang up, threw her arms around his neck, embraced and kissed him repeatedly, and took her stomacher, which was made of pure gold, and hung it round his neck. Then he went to the second princess, who had a dragon with 5 heads to comb, and delivered her also. And to the youngest, who had a dragon with 4 heads, he went likewise. And they all rejoiced and embraced him and kissed him without stopping. Then he rang very loud, so that those above heard him, and he placed the princesses one after the other in the basket, and had them all drawn up. But when it came to his own turn, he remembered the words of the elf, who had told him that his comrades did not mean well by him. So he took a great stone which was lying there and placed it in the basket, and when it was about halfway up, his false brothers above cut the rope, so that the basket with the stone fell to the ground, and they thought that he was dead, and ran away with the 3 princesses, making them promise to tell their father that it was they who had delivered them. And then they went to the king, and each demanded a princess in marriage. In the meantime, the youngest huntsman was wandering about the 3 chambers in great trouble, fully expecting to have to end his days there, when he saw, hanging on the wall, a flute. Then said he, "Why dost hang there? No one can be merry here." He looked at the dragon's head likewise and said, "You too cannot help me now." He walked backwards and forwards for such a long time that he made the surface of the ground quite smooth, but at last other thoughts came to his mind, and he took the flute from the wall and played a few notes on it, and suddenly a number of elves appeared, and with every note that he sounded, one more came. Then he played until the room was entirely filled. They all asked what he desired, so he said he wished to get above ground back to daylight, on which they seized him by every hair that grew on his head, and thus they flew with him onto the earth again. When he was above ground, he at once went to the king's palace, just as the wedding of one princess was about to be celebrated, and he went to the room where the king and his 3 daughters were. When the princesses saw him, they fainted. The king was angry and ordered him to be put in prison at once, because he thought he must have done some injury to the children. When the princesses came to themselves, however, they entreated the king to set him free again. The king asked why, and they said that they were not allowed to tell that, but their father said that they were to tell it to the stove. And he went out, listened at the door, and heard everything. Then he caused the 2 brothers to be hanged on the gallows, and to the 3rd he gave his youngest daughter. And on that occasion I wore a pair of glass shoes, and I struck them against a stone, and they said, "Clink," and were broken. The Foundling Bird. There was once a forester who went into the forest to hunt, and as he entered it, he heard a sound of screaming as if a little child were there. He followed the sound, and at last came to a high tree, and at the top of this a little child was sitting. For the mother had fallen asleep under the tree with the child, and a bird of prey had seen it in her arms, had flown down, snatched it away, and set it on the high tree. The forester climbed up, brought the child down, and thought to himself, "Thou wilt take him home with thee, and bring him up with thy Lena." He took it home, therefore, and the 2 children grew up together. The one, however, which he had found on a tree was called a foundling bird, because a bird had carried it away. The foundling and Lena loved each other so dearly that when they did not see each other they were sad. The forester, however, had an old cook who one evening took 2 pails and began to fetch water, and did not go once only, but many times out to the spring. Lena saw this and said, "Hark you, old Sana, why are you fetching so much water?"
"If thou wilt never repeat it to anyone, I will tell thee why."
So Lena said, no, she would never repeat it to anyone. And then the cook said,
"Early tomorrow morning, when the forester is out hunting, I will heat the water, and when it is boiling in the kettle, I will throw in the foundling, and will boil him in it."
Betimes next morning the forester got up and went out hunting, and when he was gone, the children were still in bed. Then Lena said to the foundling, "If thou wilt never leave me, I too will never leave thee." The foundling said, "Neither now nor ever will I leave thee." Then said Lena, "Then I will tell thee, Last night, old Sana carried so many buckets of water into the house that I asked her why she was doing that, and she said that if I would promise not to tell anyone, she would tell me. And I said I would be sure not to tell anyone, and she said that early tomorrow morning when father was out hunting, she would set the kettle full of water, throw thee into it and boil thee. But we will get up quickly, dress ourselves and go away together. The two children therefore got up, dressed themselves quickly and went away. When the water in the kettle was boiling, the cook went into the bedroom to fetch the foundling and throw him into it. But when he came in and went to the beds, both the children were gone. Then she was terribly alarmed, and she said to herself,
What shall I say now when the forester comes home and sees that the children are gone? They must be followed instantly to get them back again.
Then the cook sent 3 servants after them, who were to run and overtake the children. The children, however, were sitting outside the forest, and when they saw from afar the 3 servants running, Lena said to the foundling, Never leave me, and I will never leave thee. The foundling said, Neither now nor ever. Then said Lena, Do thou become a rose tree, and I the rose upon it? When the 3 servants came to the forest, nothing was there but a rose tree and 1 rose on it. But the children were nowhere. Then said they, There is nothing to be done here. And they went home and told the cook that they had seen nothing in the forest but a little rose bush with 1 rose on it. Then the old cook scolded and said,
You simpletons! You should have cut the rose bush in 2 and have broken off the rose and brought it home with you. Go and do it once.
They had therefore to go out and look for the 2nd time. The children, however, saw them coming from a distance. Then Lena said, Foundling bird, never leave me, and I will never leave thee. The foundling said, Neither now nor ever. Said Lena, Then do thou become a church, and I'll be the chandelier in it. So when the 3 servants came, nothing was there but a church, with a chandelier in it. They said therefore to each other, What can do here? Let us go home. When they got home, the cook asked if they had not found them. So they said no, they had found nothing but a church, and that there was a chandelier in it. And the cook scolded them and said,
You fools! Why did you not pull the church to pieces and bring the chandelier home with you?
And now the old cook herself got on her legs and went with the 3 servants in pursuit of the children. The children, however, saw from afar that the 3 servants were coming, and the cook waddling after them. Then said Lena, Foundling bird, never leave me, and I will never leave thee. Then said the foundling, Neither now nor ever. Said Lena, Be a fish pond, and I will be the duck upon it. The cook, however, came up to them, and when she saw the pond, she lay down by it, and was about to drink it up. But the duck swam quickly to her, seized her head in its beak, and drew her into the water, and there the old witch had to drown. Then the children went home together, and were heartily delighted, and if they are not dead, they are living still. The Water-Nix. A little brother and sister were once playing by a well, and while they were thus playing, they both fell in. A Water-Nix lived down below, who said,
Now I've got you. Now you shall work hard for me.
And carried them off with her. She gave the girl dirty, tangled flax to spin, and she had to fetch water in a bucket with a hole in it. And the boy had to hew down a tree with a blunt axe, and they got nothing to eat but dumplings as hard as stones. Then at last the children became so impatient that they waited until one Sunday when the Nix was at church and ran away, But when church was over, the Nix saw that the birds were flown and followed them with great strides. The children saw her from afar, and the girl threw a brush behind her, which formed an immense hill of bristles, with thousands and thousands of spikes, over which the Nix was forced to scramble with great difficulty. At last, however, she got over. When the children saw this, the boy threw behind him a comb which made a great hill of combs with 1,000 times 1,000 teeth. But the Nix managed to keep herself steady with them, and at last crossed over that. Then the girl threw behind her a looking glass, which formed a hill of mirrors and was so slippery that it was impossible for the Nix to cross it. Then she thought,
I will go home quickly and fetch my axe and cut the hill of glass in half.
Long before she returned, however, and had hewn through the glass, the children had escaped to a great distance, and the Water-Nix was obliged to betake herself to her well again.